was born in Seacliff, lived in Glen Cove, Bethpage, and then when we came out here 17 years ago, we came for a ride. And I just fell in love with. We lived on the North Fork, but we had always come out to the Hampton side, and I just loved the whole East End. It's just a pretty place. And so we did buy a vacation home in Southold, and being that we spent a lot of vacation and leisure time, I didn't do any research. I'm a history teacher. I started as a high school history teacher, and then a 6th grade teacher, and writing and history teacher. And so I'm a history buff, and I love anything to do with how people used to live. So when we moved here full-time, which is about 5 years ago, I wanted to become a writer. I had retired from teaching and wanted to become a writer. And I started, well, if you know anyone who wants to be a writer, you receive lots and lots of rejections, and I did. And finally, I received the nicest rejection I ever received. And from the History Press, which is the publisher of the first book. And the next email I got from this editor, in that email, she asked me to write a book. So, and it became that book. And I'm sure people heard me screaming from my room. But I was so excited to be asked to do this. And that's when I learned, I did a lot of research. And some people don't like to do the research, and I enjoyed it because I found out so much about the North Fork, but the whole East End, and all the islands. I did a lot of research on all that. Yes?
Okay, quick question. Did she specify you do the specific book or a book?
Well, that's what's interesting. History Press usually publishes local history books, and in Southold, hi.
Hello.
In Southold, they have a book called The North Fork. So I had to try to persuade her to do something a little different. So that's when we came up with the North Fork and Islands. Yeah, that's why we came up with that. But she did, it was specific, in other words, it's 100 vintage photographs. And then, you're right, the introduction and so on. But I just learned so much information, and my head was swimming.
Yeah, that's right.
And when I learned the information, and then, of course, in order to write captions, I needed to do that research so I would know what I was talking about, and not just say, this picture is, I wanted to know the area. So I found it very, very, not just interesting, but I learned a lot. And while I was writing this book, the idea, people have asked me that, the idea for another book came into my mind, and I always wanted to write historical fiction, and so the idea came to my mind, and then I started to write it. But it took a year and a half. It took me a year and a half. I was babysitting for my granddaughter in between, and I had to immerse myself in 1650. That's when it takes place. So I come back from the 21st century and immerse myself in my research again so that I could write the story. This one is 100, yeah, thank you. 101 glimpses of the North Fork and Islands. That's the first one. And oh yeah, this is my historical, young adult historical fiction novella. That's what the editor told me is short. So, but I wanted to weave, because I was a history teacher, I really wanted to weave the factual information into an entertaining story, because I think all of us, you can learn from reading about history, but if it's too dry and boring, you're not going to enjoy it. And I wanted people to enjoy it, children and adults. So that's why I came up with the story. And I interviewed, it's funny because a young white settler, his son, meets up with a Fort Korchog Native American boy. And that's really how the story begins that way, and they have to resolve something that happens, and that's the whole story is really about that. But in the meantime, I wanted people to learn what it was like to live in the Fort Orchard, and how the people lived there. So I wove that into the story, and of course, I wanted people to understand what it was like to live in 1650. And when you're writing the book, it didn't dawn on me until I started writing it. I didn't know anything about how they lived. You know, you don't wake up in the morning and put the coffee pot on and put the TV on. So I really had to learn a lot about daily life, and that's what I found fascinating. And that's why I'm dressed this way. Because the people back then made their own material. This is linen. They didn't make cotton up here in Southold. And of course, they didn't have denim, but you have to sort of use your imagination. And they always wore aprons. The women always wore aprons, and this is a mob cap. The women always wore caps, and we think, I was trying to figure out why. I think it was to keep their hair out of their eyes when they were working, or it was to keep them warm, or it was both. Trying to figure out why they did different things. And so that's basically what the story is about, the two boys meeting, and you learn about each family and how they lived. The first community in Southold was a religious community, and who started their own well, the religious community provided them with laws that governed everybody, but the only people who were there were in that religious community, except for the Native Americans who had their own community. So I wanted to show all of that. So I interviewed people at the Southold Presbyterian Church. There was no Presbyterian church then. It was the meeting house they really were the Puritans. We called them Puritans, but they were the separatists who came from England, who settled in New Haven, who came to the North Fork and then the South Fork, both areas. So
They settled in New Haven?
First. Yeah, they were in New Haven first.
So they were in the Boston area, then went to New Haven?
Yeah, they moved. Yeah, there were groups. There were splinter groups.